Welcome to episode 2 of Motor City UK. I'm Rob Capaldi. Let me start by saying a huge thank you to everyone that tuned in to our first episode. If you took the time to listen, leave a comment, review, or follow us on any of our platforms, please know I really appreciate you and your support. If you're here for episode 2 and haven't listened to our first episode yet, make sure you revisit it to hear the story of how the car industry arrived in Coventry 140 years ago. It's a perfect place to begin a journey into Coventry's automotive heritage. I'm sure you'll find it interesting. For this latest episode, we're coming bang up to date as we dive into the automotive subculture that pulses through Coventry today. Every year, the famous city centre and historic cathedral ruins are transformed, welcoming show cars, clubs, creatives, and of course the public to experience the annual festival of motoring that is Coventry MotoFest. The festival has seen ups and downs since it was first staged in 2014, traversing the regulatory challenges that come from driving race cars on the public road, making use of Coventry's iconic ring road for live motorsport action, and of course the inevitable impact of a global pandemic. I recently visited Jubilee Church, just a stone's throw away from Sandy Lane, the birthplace of Coventry's car industry, to meet with event director James Noble, an automotive industry veteran, community leader and extreme petrolhead, to get the inside story on all things Motorfest. The format of this episode is more of an interview than the first one, with James telling his personal and professional story and the journey that led him to run Motorfest.
I moved here nearly 26 years ago. The automotive industry brought me here. I previously in London, and I came here to do a master's in automotive design at Coventry University, and moved my very young family at that point to this city that everybody said, why are you moving to Coventry? You know, you live in one of the coolest parts of London. It's all kicking off in a great way. Well, Coventry, what? And I knew that this city was the birthplace of the UK automotive industry very much. I knew as a very much a car enthusiast, I knew that there were many brands that I loved, had their roots in the city. As you live in the city, it gets under your skin. The heritage gets under your skin, but also because I worked in the industry. So when I finished at Coventry Uni, I went on to work for Volkswagen Group, and I found that it didn't matter, although I was UK based, it didn't matter where I went in the world, I would find people who were educated in the city. You'd go to Ingolstadt and, with Audi, and there'd be somebody from Coventry working there. It was just, the influence was everywhere. And I even when I was working in the industry, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if Coventry knew a bit more about its impact as a place? In the early 2000s, the last of the large-scale manufacturing was just beginning to finish. Wrighton was in the process of closing. Browns Lane, was finishing for Jaguar. But also in that time, I was aware that a whole bunch of global companies had set up consultancies in Coventry, or were using consultancies in and around the city, and that secretly a number of major companies had design studios here, and nobody knew. And you'd meet people who would be, we used to be this great manufacturing city. And I think, yeah, but you're now the worldwide centre for automotive research and development, and you don't know it.
Certainly in the 26 years you've been here, that has only got stronger, in my opinion. In that Wrighton was torn down in 2007. Yeah. In the period since then, the number of tech startups that have arrived, the number of university courses that have developed, the government has invested huge amounts in developing the city just in that time period. I do think that the image that the city has that you mentioned, we still hear it. We still hear that sort of feedback that it's not as good as it was. The volume manufacturing isn't here anymore. What do you think the city could do to try and build that image in a more positive light?
I think that it's difficult because when you're a manufacturing base, what you do is very visible. So research and development by its very nature is not. Lots of it is secret. Lots of it happens behind closed doors. And so it's almost, I think, that the industry can't shout loudly about what it's doing, which is part of why Motorfest as a festival exists, to tell that story. But also, I think that there are other things going on that we could make more of. I mean, the council would like the city to be a kind of transport sandbox. They'd like it to be a place where ideas can be tried out. That often has negative impacts on local people rather than positive. You put a few hundred yards of highly experimental tramway in, and people don't understand why. It's difficult to tell that story well. So what we try and do with Motorfest is just tell that story as best we can and bring it to as wide an audience as possible.
What's the reception in the public of that sort of contrasting view? And I can imagine if you have a row of singers and humbers, you'll get the local interest of, wow, these are parts of our history, we're very interested in it. If you have the new supercars and sports cars and people come and see this exciting sort of enthusiast focused element, how do you gauge the reaction to? I know that last year you had a Formula E team that were Jaguar had the car there. What was the reception to seeing something like that?
Well, I think that's what's so interesting, because when people are presented with the new stuff, they're as interested as the old stuff, and there's two things going on. When you see a line of Roots Group vehicles, of singers, humbers, or even as we get into, noughties and 90s vehicles very much being considered classics, you get a row of Peugeots or, a beige Metro even, with Coventry made suspension. It's people love that just as much. And with those vehicles, you get the stories, you get the touch points of, my dad put the carpets in those, or my mum worked in the upholstery shop, or my dad worked on the line, or my grandfather worked on the line, or whatever it was. You get those stories, which are lovely, and the owners love that, because suddenly you meet the person that did the veneers for the door cappings for your Jag, or whatever it was, and that happens all the time. But equally, you go to the other end of, when we're running a large scale festival, you go to the other end of the festival and you've got all the new tech coming, and of course it's exciting, and you get lots of debate. I think the joy for me is you see kids getting just interested in transport, full stop, and they don't differentiate. It's all interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So let's dial back a little bit, take a step back to your personal history. You come to university in Coventry, studied, worked in the industry. What's the journey from finishing university to running Motorfest?
Yeah, it's a strange story. So I've always been somebody that's had a strong Christian faith. So all the time I was working in the industry, I was also very involved in the local church here in Coventry, and have been involved in the leadership of that in a kind of voluntary capacity. And in 2011, the church asked whether I would consider joining the staff team. And it's one of those moments where you go, yeah, but I love what I do in industry. I'd worked for Volkswagen Group for quite a long time by then. And I remember there was a moment where, in fact, at about the time the church asked me to come and work for them, Volkswagen had also started talking to me about a new role, a new position, and all the rest of it. I thought, yeah, okay, I've just got to make a decision here. And I talked to Volkswagen and said, look, this is what's going on. I've been asked whether I'd do this. You're asking me whether I'd do this. I really don't know. And Volkswagen said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll hold your job open for a year or so. You go off and try it. And by the way, here's a laptop to write your sermons on. And if it doesn't work out, you can come back. And off I went, and very quickly found that lots of what I was doing in industry actually applied into a church context. So I found myself working full-time for a local, thriving young church in the city, and which is where we are now, which is, and Motorfest has its office there, or shares its office, in fact, with Jubilee Church. And about a year into the job, the city council reached out to a whole bunch of people in my position, so a whole bunch of community leaders, not necessarily church or faith leaders, just all sorts of community leaders, and also captains of industry leaders. And they said, we've got a challenge as a city, and that is that we can see that the city has got a great future. It's expanding industrially, it's expanding in research and development. We've got lots of exciting things coming down the line, but nobody here knows that story. And I thought, yeah, I recognise that. They basically got us all together and kind of workshopped it and said, what ideas have you got? And to be honest, they were quite visionary in doing that. It's not a normal thing for city councils to do. But one of the things that came out of that kind of workshopping of ideas was a germ of an idea that I'd had for doing just a little local festival that celebrated the heritage, but also showcased what was going on now. As best as possible. And everybody seemed sort of said that, well, that's a great idea. We should do that. And ever since I've moved to the city, I'd also looked at the ring road and thought that'd make a great racetrack. So I thought, well, I wonder if we can pull this together. So the city council said, yeah, great idea. We've got no money, but we'll back you in every other way possible to make this happen. And so I thought, well, I've no idea. I've run a few small scale events, been involved in a few small scale events with Volkswagen. What I knew is that I enjoyed classic car events, but my family didn't. My family didn't like traipsing around fields full of old cars or round the NEC. And so it had to have a bit more life to it than that. It had to be a truly sort of family festival, because the whole point was to touch people who weren't car culture people or bike culture people. So we kind of pushed the idea around a bit. I reached out to people I knew. There's a guy called Neil Campbell, who in those days wrote for Practical Classics magazine, that covered a restoration that I'd done, car restoration I'd done. Neil was local, a real kind of Cov kid, and a few other people, a chap who worked for Coventry University, and a couple of others. And I sat down and said, look, had this idea, how do we make it happen? Who do we know? And it kind of grew from there, really. That would have been around 2012 we started having those conversations. And of course, the other thing that was happening back then was that there was the whole just feel good of the Olympics happening. And there was a feeling that you could do anything, and I think public spaces, exactly that, exactly. And so I think we were riding that wave as well. But that also helped because it meant the council didn't throw up loads of barriers, and we were coming up with mad ideas and they were going, all right, okay, how does that happen? Rather than no.
So how quickly did you jump into the different elements of the show, with the static part, the concours, the live motorsport elements? Did you immediately go feet first with everything, or did you sort of build over a number of years?
Well, we built over a number of years, but the elements were there. The core elements were there from the start. So 2014 was the first event, and we had some live music. We had kind of the stuff that people love. The street food part of the festival was there in a we had the Ace Cafe with us that year, and they brought their kitchen and, kind of made it all happen. And we had the classic car displays. We had some new manufacturers there, and we had a parade of vehicles that paraded around the ring road on one closed lane, kind of behind a pace car, driven by Ralph Hosier. And, and people loved it. And we didn't really bother counting the visitors, but I remember Neil thought it was, we probably had about 70,000 people through, something like that. It's a good numbers that first year. We thought, okay, this works. And then the following year, we just fine-tuned the format. We introduced what became our sprint circuit that year, which was running in demo-only form, but on a closed section of ring road that was closed in both directions. Yeah, and it just kind of grew steadily then, right up to 2019, which was the last time we ran at full scale before the COVID pandemic hit. Yeah. And so we kind of had this nice incremental build. We made some mistakes, we learned some stuff, and we just built it. So by the time we get to 2018, the Motorsport UK finally gets the legislation changed to allow street racing in the UK again, and we become the first place to hold a competitive or a timed street race event on a UK street since the Birmingham Super Prix in the 80s. Yeah.
Fantastic. So COVID then hit. That obviously had a huge impact on events and public engagement. Where do you stand now in the recovery from COVID? Are you still on the ramp back up to where you were previously?
It's been a bumpy ride. I'll be absolutely honest with you. We've had some good years, and we're currently in a bit of a fallow period. So it's interesting at the moment. We set Motorfest up as a not-for-profit limited company, so we're not a charity, but it's the same format many clubs are constituted in, and we have an entirely volunteer base, so nobody's paid currently, and everybody does it for love, which is great. We've got a really fantastic committed team of volunteers who make Motorfest happen, and they're more than volunteers, really. It's their thing. It really is. It's great. And Kevin Robinson and Mark are just lead our classic car team these days. They're just brilliant committed guys. Faith, who does our social media, and Sophie and Kate in the background doing all the admin. It works really, really, really well. Yeah, absolutely. Wilson, who leads our bike team, and it's that commitment and that passion, and everybody loves the city, loves the area, and loves the industry, and the community around it. So it's proper grassroots stuff still.
Community is such an important word in this kind of space. How important do you think it is to not just run an event but build a community beyond your community of volunteers that are involved, but looking at the wider public perception? I know you do the Club Motorfest with sort of the sort of weekend meets and drives and such like. How do you balance between those two different things? Is one more important than the other, or?
It's a really good question. So Club Motorfest is actually one of the things that we started during COVID, because we realised that by that point, we had a festival that was attracting over 100,000 people in 2 days, and that there was this core group of enthusiasts who were bringing their vehicles, who were making it happen. We didn't really know who they were. So as COVID hit, we began to think, well, if we had a club, we had a really low bar for entry, like it was free to be a member, but what would make you join was the fact that you were as passionate as we were about, transport, be it four-wheeled or two or three or whatever, and the city, then it was going to be something you'd want to be part of. So we started Club Motorfest, and that has become a thing, as you say, that happens all year round now, and so it enables us to go to other shows. So the club goes to the NEC Classic Motor Show in November. We're going to be at the Restoration Show in March, and that's great for meeting the community. Our bike team get involved in most of the bike events that happen throughout the country, and we can be there. As enthusiasts, but also showcasing what we do here. But it also enables, people that have been involved in the event from the start, love what we do, to keep up to date and do something all year round. So it has become a community of people, which is great. Yeah. So I mean that's part of your question about COVID. That's part of what happened during COVID to kind of keep the whole thing going. Because to be honest, it could have killed it. Yeah.
Interesting. So what about for you personally? You obviously worked in the car industry. Is that something that's been born out of passion? Are you a car guy? Do you have a hobby car that you still kind of tinker with at the weekends?
Absolutely. No, I ended up in the industry almost by accident. So I went to art school. I originally trained as a furniture and interior designer, and that's what I was doing in London. But I've been a passionate car person from a young age. So according to my mother, the first words I learned were Ford Cortina, and I knew what all the cars were as a kid. I was one of those. When I was old enough to ride a bike, I would be taking bikes apart and putting them back together again. And as soon as my parents finally gave up resisting and allowed me to have something rotten to play with, at the age of 15, I think I started trying to build a Triumph Herald-based kit car in the 80s. And which got sold as an incomplete project because it ended up remaining at my parents' house long after I'd moved out, and progressed on to Triumphs. I had a Triumph Dolomite as my first proper car. And well, in fact, there's this moment when I'm 10 years old. My best friend, my parents lived in Cambridgeshire, so that's where I grew up. My best friend at school, his grandfather had worked for Hillman or Talbot, and I remember as a 10-year-old going to stay with him at his grandparents' house in Coventry, and being taken to Coventry Cathedral and then to the Herbert Museum, which in those days was where the collection of Coventry cars was before the Transport Museum was founded, and just thinking it was the coolest museum in the world because it had all this old stuff. It had cars as well. So Coventry, lasting impact, that trip as a 10-year-old. I didn't realise that many years later I'd be living here, kind of being a major part of city life. So anyway, I triumphed absolutely all the way. I had Dolomite 1500 HL, which was bought in those days. It was probably only 12 years old, but it was just on the cusp of classic kind of status, and rustier than many 20-year-old cars I've I've owned since. And then I've had lots. I had a Similar GTE, which I loved for years, that had a Stage 3 tuned Essex V6 headers and all the rest of it. It was a lovely thing. And then we started. I met my wife. She's not a car person at all, which is why Motorfest is so broad, why it has music, and why it's in a city centre, not in a field, and all the rest of it. We progressed on to, because I liked an engineering challenge, even though I wasn't really trained as an engineer. And I did what the engineers call colouring in when I got into car design. I went and learned how to draw cars rather than take them apart. But really, I was a nuts and bolts man at heart. I just wasn't clever enough to be an engineer. And I'd rebuilt a number of cars by then, and I remember we by then had a Triumph Dolomite Sprint, which Sarah loved, and we drove to south of France and back and did all sorts of things. It was just great. But she got pregnant, and we needed a car with power steering. And I was like, well, what's interesting that's got power steering and is affordable? And I remember that's when we bought our first Citroen. So I then had a long line of hydraulic Citroens. We had a whole bunch of XMs, a couple of CXs. I rebuilt a CX Familiar from the ground up, which is just only in the last 3 years I sold to a collector in Australia, so that's now in Australia. But it was a stunning, it was a GTI Turbo 2 petrol Familiar, but with a presidential spec interior. So it had full leather, kind of 8 seats, in fact, and, just crazy spaceship thing. And I've still got a little Citroen AX 1.1, proper festival of the unexceptional car, which is great, which the kids all learn to drive in, and we've done numerous road trips in because that's what they can drive. So, I've driven around Scotland and all the rest of it. And so I currently have, I have a very, very early L322 Range Rover, which was designed in Coventry, so designed in Canley in the old Triumph Works. All that design work was done here. And I have an Aston Martin DB7, which again has a massive Coventry kind of link. So the body shells were made at Holbrooks at the old Mayflower plant, which is where they also made the MGF body shells. And but what people don't realise about that car is that much of the engineering work was done in Coventry, because there's lots of commonality with the Jaguar. But also Ian Callum, who did the body design for the car, had spent some time at Lanchester Polytechnic, which became Coventry University, and so there was this strong kind of Coventry connection for that car, but it and of course bolted together just down the road, and so that's great fun, and that's been a bit of a rolling restoration. It hadn't moved a wheel for 10 years when I bought it, and it hasn't needed as much work as I thought it would, and that's great fun. And then I also have, we've just in the last couple of years, we've rebuilt a Mark 1 Renault Master van, which is a 1990 Mark 1 Renault Master. and we've just driven that to Siena and back last summer, which was 2,600-mile round trip in a 35-year-old van, and we absolutely love it. I love it. It's a really functional vehicle, brilliant design, designed by Robert Opron, who designed the CX and the Citroen SM and the GS. He then moved to Renault and designed the Fuego and the Renault 25. And so, brilliant designer. And so love his work. And so when we thought, it'd be quite fun to build a camper, I looked for an unusual choice and found it. So yeah, that's been great fun. So we completely rebuilt that, although we found a rust-free van with a single lift-up tailgate and lots of other rare stuff in the UK. It was like, it had to be.
Coventry as a city has been home to many car brands over the years. Not many of them exist anymore, unfortunately. If you could rewind your mind to think of some of those historic brands or vehicles that are there from the past and reinvent or reimagine any of those, what would you try and bring back?
There are many that are worthy. I think there is one that I do not understand why it was allowed to die, and that is the Triumph brand. It's really interesting. If you look at who owns the Triumph car brand now, it is BMW. And I'm old enough to remember 1970s road tests always pegged BMW cars against Triumphs. When you know the architecture of both vehicles, and you know that BMW's a 5 Series, early 5 Series, is almost a carbon copy of a Triumph 2000 stroke Stag underneath. It's got the same trailing arm suspension. Early BMWs were massively, or modern BMWs, massively influenced by Triumph. And, they actually shared a designer. So Michelotti designed for Triumph and then went on to design for BMW. So even if you look at the what BMW's called the Hofmeister flick, this thing this graphic that goes around the rear, it was there on the Triumph Dolomite first. It's there. If you ever looked at, a second generation 3 Series BMW next to a Triumph Dolomite Sprint, you can see lineage between them. It's not surprising that BMW held on to that brand. And when there was the TR concept car that was launched last year, shown 2 years ago for one of the TR anniversaries, and which BMW licensed, and you just think there is a brand crying out to be reborn.
How do you manage your time on the festival weekend? How do you not just get totally distracted by looking around all of the fantastic machinery that's on display? How do you actually run a festival when you've got that level of distraction in front of you?
You do a lot of walking. And yeah, I think I'm also one of these people that I can see things quickly, so I will, I can walk past stuff and appreciate it, so I don't get as much of the chance I'd like to stop and chat. And that's one of the joys of doing the other events, actually, is doing the smaller Club Motorfest events, is you do have time to stop and chat. It's great.
Yeah, it's a balance, I guess, between the what's interesting. Is it the cars or is it the people, or is it the cars that bring the people?
It's kind of both. I mean, cars are great because for those that love car culture like us, it's our life, but they're also for other people, they're social history. They're the stories. It's all of that, and it's a bit of both, isn't it?
My kids love Motorfest. Like we came along last year in the summer. It was a smaller event now than it was a few years ago, but they took a lot of excitement out of it, and particularly the part I really liked was the concourse inside the cathedral. How did you come up with that as an idea to put that event inside that location? Because it's, I think, probably one of the most visually appealing locations you could put any part of that show in the city centre.
We'd spotted from the very early days of the event that the cathedral ruins would be a good place to put the event. And if you don't know Coventry, that there is a cathedral that was bombed in the Second World War. There is a stunning 20th century cathedral next to it, which is one of the kind of architectural wonders of the 20th century. And then these beautiful ruins, which are atmospheric. And we played around with various things in that space, and we'd also thought it would be really good at some point to introduce a Concours d'Elegance, but to do it kind of Coventry style. To just make it a bit more accessible, slightly less elite, and it was one of the things that, again, COVID gave us the time to kind of pull that idea together. And then there was also just the right people coming along at the right moment. So the guy that heads up our concourse team is a guy called Tony O'Keefe, who a long career with Jaguar. And when we'd first run the event, Tony had organised a run of Jaguar's crown jewels. So the Silk Cut Le Mans car, the Le Mans winning car, the Quaker State XJ, and various sort of various special E types and the C types and D types, and they'd run this parade of non-road legal vehicles behind a police escort, kind of into the city, and so I knew that Tony could do anything. Because if you can run a Le Mans car on public roads without them being closed behind just pick up the phone to the police and say, "Can we do this?"
That's a sight in itself, isn't it?
It was amazing. So I knew Tony could do anything, and Tony had just retired, and so I said, "Tony, do you fancy coming to run a concours?"
So what are the rules around the concours? You said it's a bit less formal than maybe some of the other events. Is it more about making sure that you choose the right cars that are going to be of interest to the audience, or is it about the competitive element to it?
It's both. It's both, but the cars, for us, story is important. So the quality of the vehicles is getting higher every year. So of course there is that element of competition, but equally we will always find a place for a fascinating vehicle with a great story. And most of the other factor is that most of the vehicles on display will have to have a Coventry link, although we are. We have had sort of international classes and invitational classes as well, and that's become part of it. But also in terms of age, it's incredibly broad. So we've gone from proper Edwardian to we've had noughties Jags in there. 10-year-old Aston Martins that have had body shells made in the city, that sort of thing. So it's deliberately broad, and then it's not a dress up, it's a dress down, so our judges, and we've always had a great selection of celebrity judges. So Sarah Crabtree will come and judge for us. We've had Richard Noble, who's no relation, the land speed record holder, as one of our judges. We've Ian Tyrrell is a regular judge for us, and Mark Allen from the Antiques Roadshow as well. And they love coming because it is just a bit more relaxed than the other events.
That's great. So you've mentioned COVID, you've mentioned driving Jaguar Le Mans cars on the public roads. Are they the biggest challenges you've run into whilst running the festival, or is there any other big hurdles that you've had to jump over?
I think the biggest challenges really have come from the fact that we're really just a bunch of naive enthusiasts with a passion for what we do and what the city does. So, you end up with big ideas that you then try and work out how to make it happen. So I think, getting legal motorsport happening in the city, getting that funded, because we've never had it, everything is privately funded. It's all done through sponsorship. And every year has always been, how do we raise the money that, you need to run a festival like this? And then, kind of doing as much with that money as possible. And so that's always the biggest challenge. And, in the current times, I think are more economically straitened than most people realise. What happens when you're in an environment like we are at the moment is that companies are less prepared to take risks, and that impacts on, things like Motorfest's bottom line. Ultimately, we simply don't have as much money as we used to have to do the event, and that can mean that it does mean that you're not able to do as much. So you mentioned last year we went from 2024, which was the 10th anniversary, where we had probably about 250,000 people through the city, and the biggest event we'd ever run. And we had, huge drift arena in a car park, and we had the ring road racing happening, and it was all absolutely amazing. And then the year after, we were really only able to run a small event that didn't have a ring road closure, and and that ultimately is down to, can we raise the money to put the show on? It's as simple as that.
Wow. Do you have sort of long-term commercial partners that keep you going from that point of view, or are you sort of on a year-to-year basis? You're chasing new people.
Historically, we've had long-term partners, and we've had people that support us year on year. And at the moment, it's I think we're at a point where we're just developing some new ideas, building some new relationships, and what we've announced so far for this year is that we'll be running basically the event that we did last year again on the 6th and 7th of June, which we're calling Motorfest Classic, and that will focus on the historic elements of the event. So there will not be quite so much new stuff. We'll probably still have some new tech there, but it will be really about the historic part of what makes Motorfest. And we're still working in the background on what we do with motorsport and how we develop that, because also the other thing we found is the sprint had kind of run its course. It was the same format every year, and so we need a new format. So what we're trying to do at the moment in the background is kind of work on a new format and work on how that's funded, and then we can bring that back online at some point.
So what about for this year? Is there any new elements that you're going to be throwing in there, or is it going to be quite a close carbon copy of what you had last year?
I think it'll be quite similar to last year, different. I mean, some lovely things going on. We've got the XJ40 anniversary. We're hosting at the event, which is great, and so that's going to be our big kind of feature piece for this year. And we've got some really rare XJ40 prototypes coming, and all sorts of other stuff, which will be very exciting. Yeah, I mean, at this stage in January, we've got bits of motorsport. We've got the Auto Test and Auto Solo happening. I'm talking to other clubs and organisations about other bits that may well plug in, and they'll be announced in the coming weeks.
Perfect. That sounds great. So what about long-term future? 10th anniversary in 2024. You'd seen quite a shift in content of the festival over that period of time, and then obviously coming into last year, another big shift again. Where would you like to be in another 10 years' time? Clearly, you're still going to be in Coventry. You're not leaving the city. What looks different 10 years in the future?
That's a great question. I can see it going in so many different directions. I think there's some ambitions we have, and whether those ambitions are realised or not, depends on the right people coming along. It depends on the right funding coming along. And what we know is that when we do something, whether we do it small or whether we do it big, it will have an impact, commensurate to the size that you're able to do it. So from the very early days, we've talked about having a kind of Motorfest venue. So one of our very first partners was the Ace Cafe, and we sort of, wouldn't be cool to have something like that in Coventry, a kind of permanent home, and it's something we regularly talk to the city council about, because the way that we know how to run events, so in many ways what we need is a bit of waste ground. And you start it as a mini event with some street food traders and that kind of thing, and you can grow it from there, but you end up with kind of regular meets going on. So there is, that is something that we regularly talk about. And one day those conversations might actually lead to something happening. But, it is about, what I've found is sometimes these things come together and sometimes they don't. And what we don't have is a massive stack of money where you can just go, let's just go and invest in this.
I guess that's the difficulty, isn't it? Is the balance for the council between financial requirements, historical preservation, and building something for the future is quite hard for them to manage. And unfortunately, we see that there are big elements of the automotive history of the city that fall foul to the developmental requirements with some of the redevelopment that's gone on in the city centre to now. Equally, there have been other things that have happened where there's preservation going on of some of those historical sites, like what's happening just up the road. They're continuing to see investment, and actually there's development going on in the immediate geography around it.
Absolutely. And, it just has to be done in a way that's sustainable, and it has to be done in a way that these days, there simply aren't, you can't just go, right, give us £250,000 to do this or that. relies on private investors coming in. So, in many ways, it would be great if somebody who loved the city came out of the woodwork and said, we'd like to invest in Motorfest to kind of move it on for the next 10 years. But I could see, I can see a venue happening at some point. I think for the festival itself, it could go in a couple of directions. There's been something quite nice for us about running the smaller events. They're slightly friendly. That they're a bit more personal. You can stop and have those longer conversations, and that could quite happily move along. At the same time, one of the impacts that the festival has had on the city when it's running in its large scale has been massive benefit to the city. So the economic benefit that the large scale festivals brought in is about. In fact, Coventry University did an economic impact study on the 2019 event, and they estimated that it brought 10.7 million to the local economy. Now, what's difficult is that still doesn't mean, oh, great, you get a blank check from the council, because that's not money that they saw. That's money that everybody else saw. All the hotels and all the rest of it, which is great. There are many reasons why bringing a big festival back would be a good thing to do. And, we'd like to, we always said we'd like to move from time trialing and sprinting to wheel motorsport on a proper street circuit. And you never know, one day it might happen.
That'd be a big step up and quite a spectacle. Yeah, quite a spectacle. Fantastic. Anything else you would like to portray at this point? Any sort of important messages we've not covered that you'd like to highlight about Motorfest? Or
I think one of the things that you don't realise when you're in a community that can be, whatever way that you're into motorsport or you're into transport, or you're into car culture or bike culture or whatever it is, it's your thing, it's your world. What you don't often get to see, unless it's doing, an amazing charity run or whatever it is the impact it can have on others. And I think one of the reasons that we did Motorfest was the council's question to us in those very early days is, what can you do that would bring hope to the city? And what we found is a whole bunch of people who were really just car nerds and motorbike nerds did something that made everybody else feel really good about where they lived. And it's not often that you get involved in a hobby or an industry that can actually change people's outlook on life. And so I suppose it's good for people just to take that away. Maybe somebody else will look at what we've done and go, oh, I could do that in my place and make a difference. That'd be really cool. That would be a good thing to come out of Motorfest.
What do you think the future holds for cars as a popular object? If you think of young people today, we hear in the media that there are less and less young people learning to drive. There is less and less interest in cars as an enthusiast item. They're becoming more of a white good, more of a utility rather than something to be enthusiastic about. Do you buy into that, or do you think that there's ways we could engage younger people better to get them to see the excitement that we as community of enthusiasts sees?
What I see at a Motorfest event, is many, many, many young people really excited about all aspects of the industry, the culture, the history. And we get stories constantly of people coming to Motorfest and ending up having careers in the industry, which is great. And that's one of the things that we wanted to do. So whatever the big trends are doing, I know that if you run events that appeal broadly rather than being kind of closed shops, you will inspire the next generation, because there's something visceral about moving vehicles, about seeing vehicles. People connect with them, young people connect with them. And so I think what we've got to do is make sure that any opportunity we have to kind of showcase the breadth of what transport culture is, we should be doing it, because that's the way to keep the next generation involved.
What a place to end. I'm sure you'll agree that was an insightful and informative look behind the scenes of running a unique motoring event. James is clearly passionate about the message I'm trying to promote through Motor City UK. Coventry is a city that has a strong automotive heritage, a vibrant car community, and is well positioned for an exciting future. Anything that can be done to increase the younger generation's interest in our industry is for the better. Make sure you follow Coventry MotoFest on social media. They can be found on Instagram as @CovMotoFest. And be sure to come along on the 6th and 7th of June this year for Motorfest Classic in Coventry City Centre. While you're on Instagram, be sure to follow the podcast. We're simply Motor City Pod, all one word, no spaces. You can see behind the scenes as we record more episodes and keep up to date with new episodes as they're released. And finally, if you like what you've heard today, please do follow us on your podcast app of choice. Leave a quick review and be sure to click a 5-star rating to help us reach more people with stories from the UK's original motor city. Tune in next time as we continue our mission to understand the city of Coventry's unique relationship with the motor car.